just get out a spade and start digging down. Dig at a time of year when the soils are quite warm, around now or even after harvest, and have a look at how the structure is. Does it look tight? Is there good pores, good root density through it? Look for earthworms, look for other little macroorganisms like beetles and things like that, because it's all related. And if you've seen a lot of biology and movement in the soil at that time of year, then it's a good sign. But if you're not, then it could be an indication of why the fertility looks good but the soil isn't functioning as it should.
Soils are the lifeblood on every farm and of all food production. Every farmer strives to improve their soils, but that's not always easy. Factors like short-term land rental, difficult financial circumstances, or poor management practice can all take their toll. So ask yourself, are your soils improving over time? You are listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We'd really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Understanding why soil improvement matters and how the elements in that soil interact is the key to making real progress. Core soil tests, along with knowledge of soil's basic properties, can give a great insight into its condition. Tracking these over time will help you see whether your management practices are making a difference or not. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Veronica Nyhan, a plant and soil specialist with Teagasc, to discuss more in this area. Veronica, I think all farmers know the value of a good soil sample, but how much variation is there between a farmer taking sample and a technician taking sample?
To be fair now, we've never really studied the difference between farmer sampled soils and technician sampled soils, but what we do know and we have studied is the importance of sampling depth when it comes to taking a soil sample. We do know that particularly in the case of phosphorus mobility in the soil is limited. It doesn't really move. So if you're not sampling to a consistent depth, you may be actually generating a false high result. And this will give you an allowance that isn't really satisfying the needs of your crop. Equally, if you're sampling below 10 centimeters, which is the depth you want to target, then you're diluting your soil sample. I suppose a lot of the soil sampling technicians are using automated samplers on quads because of the scale, and also they're repeating this practice over and over and over again. So they're probably, maybe their consistency might be slightly higher. Having said that, I would say that any farmer who has taken the time to train themselves or done the training on how to take a soil sample, and as long as they're using, the correct equipment, it's clean, and they're doing it using the correct technique, I can't see any reason why they wouldn't get a very good and valuable soil result that will be, form the foundation or the basis of their soil nutrient management plan. Also,
Okay.
Farmers know the land probably better than the soil sampler. They do. So they're probably more in tune with the areas where the soil type might change across a large field, or areas where there might be a need to sample independently. So that's an advantage they have. But if they are getting a technician, they definitely should relay that information to them.
And with that in mind, Veronica, just in terms of in a particular field in Ireland, I think somebody quoted, could have been David Wall quoted, that there was in a field it could be 5 or 6 or maybe even 10 different types of soil within the field in terms of variability that's there. How, if a farmer is sampling that, either doing it themselves or getting somebody else to do it, how do they manage that? Is it a grid across the whole field, or do you try and go back down to the individual zones and do those individually?
Well, grid sampling is historically associated with research. So that's where you kind of map out a grid on the field and you're taking from specific sample points around the field. And it's great from when you're trying to survey or, test soil type or differences like that across the field. It's expensive generally. And, sometimes it you can get one spot, but you have no real idea of the consistency of that value around the area it's in. So I suppose zonal agronomically is the more traditional method used, and for valid reasons. But when you have high variability in soil type, it is important that you try and map to that variation as best you can. And then bringing in other factors such as a yield monitor results can be an excellent kind of add-on to help in the mapping strategy. Like a soil sample really the mapping, it cannot be overestimated how important the mapping of the field to the soil sample is before you start. So using yield monitor data, using your eye, your own visual experience as you've walked the crop all year, all of those factors, and then mapping it accordingly. Probably and is cost effective, and it'll give you a good idea of discrepancies or natural changes in your pH and your nutrient loads.
And would that be the place where farmers would see the biggest differences, Veronica, in terms of, going from, I don't know, let's say a very mineral soil or a heavyish kind of soil to something that's very light and maybe down to a black soil down towards the end of the field? Would you see big differences in terms of the likes of pH across those or some of the other elements, P's and K's?
Yeah, really. Well, the nutrient carrying capacity is completely different across each of those soil types. Humus soils tend to be very light, and they're kind of peaty nearly in nature, so they don't hold nutrients in the same way as mineral soils do. And then very light soils, where you've very sandy or free draining soils have lower cation exchange capacity, lower ability to retain nutrients compared to heavier soils. So yeah, there's huge differences, and mixing the samples really isn't giving you a best average for anything. So I know they're cost wise, and you're allowed to go up to a sample area of 5 hectares, but I would definitely recommend smaller areas of higher consistency rather than higher areas of broader kind of soil type to get real good value for the money you're putting into them.
In terms of all of the samples that have been taken, and we have a quite a large database there in the background over a long number of years, is there any trends that we're seeing in a general sense across tillage soils? Maybe pHs are stable or going up, or maybe K levels are dropping because people are getting higher yields.
In the last couple of years, we've seen changes not just in tillage but across the on a national level. But I think a lot of that has to do with the input of we've seen a kind of a surge in soil samples coming from kind of more marginal land. Um, so we've seen a lot of coming from dry stock systems with the acres being introduced. We've seen a surge in those samples. But even on the tillage side of the house, I think maybe with the kind of land grab, people are as trying to keep land area up, they're moving to more marginal ground and bringing them in and soil sampling them. So we are seeing a kind of a slight reduction in the optimals, maybe more low pH, low P's and low K's coming into the system. But I don't think that's a drop in our usual sample set. I think it's more an introduction of kind of outliers that are coming from, soil being brought back into production that maybe wasn't being managed productively for a number of years.
So, just in terms of the frequency of sampling, there's legislation out there that all tillage farmers have to sample their soil every 4 years. Am I right in saying that? But that has
Yeah.
changed a little bit, I think, over the last year. That there's more onus on the person sampling or the farmer basically to correctly identify that. You might walk us through that.
Yeah, so basically the regulations have been, and for a while now have been that a soil sample is valid for 4 years, and it's dated from the September prior to when the soil sample was taken. So that's its day one birthday kind of thing. And it can represent an area of consistent soil and cropping history of up to 5 hectares. What was introduced earlier this year and came into effect on the 14th of September, actually only last month, was a new regulation that requires that all soil samples that are used for calculating nutrient loading on a farm or the nutrient management plan have to contain some kind of a location tag on them, a georeference as such. Um, that basically on the soil report, it is printed either one of two options, a land parcel identification system number or a georeference in the form of GPS coordinates. Um, so basically, if you look at your BIS application maps, you'll see all the parcels and the subdivided parcels have this number attached to them. It's a letter which should match your herd number, and then a 10-digit number, and that must appear on a soil report now. That you are using and going to use as part of calculating your nutrient requirements. If you don't want to use the land parcel identification number, you need to use a georeference, um, basically a GPS coordinate in any of the formats, either decimal degrees, decimal minutes, seconds, or decimal degrees and decimal minutes, whatever one you choose. But you must have that on the soil report for the parcel in question. Um, and if your soil report, which can happen, especially with smaller parcels, you might have two smaller fields around the farmyard that you treat the same. Maybe they're old grass and you never really fertilize them. They're managed much the same, and you want to put them into the same soil sample box, but they have two different parcel numbers. Then you have to make sure both of them are referenced on the soil report to use them for calculating your nutrient requirement.
And Veronica, this is for all samples taken from what date? Is it everything in 2025 or is it only
No,
from
no,
mid-year?
just since the 15th of September last year, anything that's dated after, or this year, sorry, since last month, basically the middle of last month. So for this sample years.
All of the other soil samples that are there that mightn't have that on, I know a lot of them do, but mightn't have that on it, they're okay still to use for next couple of years.
Yeah, so anything that was sampled pre the 14th of September this year and is still valid, say it's in its first, second, third year, they're all fine um, to use as is. But going forward, anything that is sampling from last month on now has to have this on it. Or it's not going to be admissible in a inspection scenario. So it's essentially, when they come in and to inspect you, they'll look at the soil report, and if it says the soil was an index 1, but it doesn't have a land parcel identification number on it, they'll treat it like an index 4, and any fertilizer, phosphorus fertilizer you put on it is now exceeding your limits.
Okay. Okay. So you must have them all there and up to date.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just talk about for a second the soil report coming back to you. Done your samples, they're coming back to you in terms of the results on it. There's quite a few farmers certainly have queries around high pH levels and what effect that might have on the P. Sometimes it might look like that the P level looks pretty good and pretty high, but is that actually the case in practice in terms of availability?
No, is the short answer. So pH heavily influences nutrient availability across the board, but more than any other, phosphorus. Um, when the pH is low, it locks up phosphorus, but the Morgan's P test will highlight that and will show, so you'll get a low test result. And if you correct your pH, a lot of the locked up phosphorus will be released. Um, Unfortunately, in the situation of a high pH, the Morgan's P test isn't as effective at highlighting that. In fact, the Morgan's P test isn't really suited, it's more suited to an acidic mineral soil condition rather than an alkaline one. So what tends to happen is the test over extracts phosphorus, and it comes back with generally a high value, which isn't really reflective of what's happening in the soil situation. So where you have high pH soils, you can often get an index 4 reading, but that might not necessarily be the case of what's going on in the soil.
So practically, Veronica, what does a farmer do about that? I mean, lots of farmers are out there today or this week and next week, they're going to be planting winter cereals. pH is very high. Phosphorus levels are, as you say, they're high on the sheet, but probably not very high at all. Should the farmer be applying phosphate? Well, they can't do it after 15th September, but could if they put on stuff on the 15th September in anticipation of planting a crop, and would that have done any good, or is that a bit of a waste of time, and maybe it's better applied in the springtime?
Look, it's a complicated one because the reality is what's happening here is the calcium in the soil, which in the Midlands we have excessively high calcium levels, some cases, way over the national average. That calcium in a high pH situation is binding with any phosphorus that's applied to the soil, and that's what's locking it up. So when you put out phosphorus, even if you test kind of low in a high pH situation and you put out phosphorus, the reality is how available is it because it's going to get locked up anyway. So the strategies we use are where possible placement of fertilizer in the seed bed. But I suppose what I'd be recommending is looking at an organic manure source because that phosphorus is locked up in organic tissue, which biology will break down and cause it to release almost like a drip feed of phosphorus as the soil temperature increases and it becomes more available. Also, when you disc it in, you can incorporate it quite close to where the rooting density is or the rooting mass is, so they can access it more. Um, Having said that, at this time of year, I'd be reluctant to recommend anyone use a very high nitrogen fertilizer or organic manure. So obviously we've passed the deadline for slurries, but farmyard manures or composted manures are excellent sources, and you have an allowance to put out farmyard manure for another few weeks. But those are the ones that really might be the better option for you there. Um, but yeah, it is a challenge because, you know, even if your pH is high and it's testing low, putting blanket spreading out phosphorus, you know, it's hard to judge how available it will be in the long term because it'll still be locked up by the soil.
So it locks up relatively quickly, but in the springtime, then are you trying to match the application of the phosphorus to strong growth so it doesn't get a chance to be locked up? Is that the kind of the reasoning, is it?
Yeah, yeah. So you're trying to, by in spring sown cereals, if by placing it, you're trying to get it close to the seed, close to the root as it's growing, because that's when phosphorus is most used by the plant, or and that's its function in early growth and root growth. So you're trying to get it as close as possible to the root so that the root can access it before it's sequestered or locked by the soil.
Let's just go the other way because you mentioned earlier there was a number of maybe tillage soils on the margins coming back in with low nutrient status coming into them. In terms of liming, is there a point where putting on too much lime actually reduces the availability of maybe the trace elements?
Absolutely. So look, I suppose, and it's become a practice. I've noticed it probably more in livestock-based systems, but this practice of using Grand Lime almost like an annual fertilizer um, to keep prophylactically, I suppose, kind of almost treat pH adjustments. Look, basically, the optimum pH for all crops is it's different for all crops, and it's based on providing the most balanced nutrition for the crop because of the impact of pH on nutrient availability. Um, when your soil goes into the acidic environment or the alkaline environment, whichever, it starts to lock up nutrients. In the acidic environment, we're probably more familiar with it because more of our soils are acidic. And you see also an excessive release of nutrients that we don't want in high quantities available in our soil. But in the alkaline situation, it does the same. It'll lock up the phosphorus fairly quickly, but it'll also lock up manganese very quickly and copper, zinc, boron as well. So, you know, if you are putting out lime, you really need to apply it to the soil report, and I'd be recommending using ground limestone. It's a kind of a slow release, and the quantities that are recommended on your soil report are designed to feed or repair or correct the pH for not just 1 or 2 years, but for the 4 or 5 years until the next pH adjustment will be required. I definitely would be very careful about putting out lime without following a soil report and just putting it out. I'll put out a bag or two here or there, because as somebody who farms in the Midlands and has experience of farming a soil pH of potentially up to 7.5 to 8, it is very challenging. Nutrient deficiencies are very common in it, and it's expensive because you're correcting for them.
Yeah, obviously it's very difficult to to treat those fields that are very high pH, where it's going to, as you say, it's going to be quite expensive to repair those deficits in some of the trace elements there. But just thinking about that as well, let's just say a farmer was out there and was two different fields, side by side, give or take. The farmer's gone out, done the soil sample of both of them. They were relatively the same in terms of pH and K, but the farmer's consistently seen one field maybe 20% less yielding in comparison to the other. What are the other things that a farmer should look at other than just that soil report?
That's a great question. Look, we've been very good at looking at soil fertility, and we've been looking at it for years and talking about P and K levels and pH levels. Um, but I suppose when it comes to soil quality, soil, how a soil functions and how it functions well, and its soil health, we need to look at more than just the soil fertility. I actually this year was part of the Ground Truth project, which was promoting looking at beyond just soil fertility in soils, and we were looking at other aspects. But like a big key impactor on how a soil functions is the soil structure. Um, so if your soil is compacted or tight, it's going to have an impact on the soil microbial population, and that in turn will have a huge impact on how nutrients move through the soil. If it's compacted, like all nutrient uptake requires some amount of water, whether the nutrients is flowing into the plant with water or moving through soil water. So if it's compacted, the water balance is not functioning as it should. So look, there's a load of things other than just fertility. Soil microbial biomass, also, it's microbes that break down and cycle nutrients within the soil. They're the engine of the soil, and how the levels of those are in the soil is relevant as well. And that's a direct relation to things like compaction, but also soil organic matter content. So yeah, I would say the best thing you could do is in that situation is and by all means I would recommend testing fertility as a first check. But if you're seeing fertility is relatively okay, get out a spade. Just get out a spade and start digging down. Dig at a time of year when the soils are quite warm, around now or even after harvest, and have a look at how the structure is. Does it look tight? Is there good pores, good root density through it? It's good to do it at that time when you still have all the root, present in the soil and it's not broken down. Look for earthworms. Look for other little macroorganisms like beetles and things like that, because they feed on earthworm or microorganisms. So it's all related. And if you've seen a lot of biology and movement in the soil at that time of year, um, then it's a good sign. But if you're not, then it could be an indication of why the fertility looks good, but the soil isn't functioning as it should.
Veronica, there's some good resources available from Teagasc around this. Getting out your spade, having a look to kind of see what's in there. There's an ABC of soils, is that right? Is there a few videos as well you might be able to direct people to?
Yeah, so as I said, the Ground Truth project we did this year was all about simple on-farm ways of testing your soil and, getting people, I suppose, soil literate or aware of what the different aspects of soil health are and how to look at them. They're all available on the Teagasc website. If you just Google Ground Truth resources, it'll take you directly to a page where you'll get loads of videos and little pamphlets of step-by-step guides how to do all the tests. There's also an email address there if you want to send an email to it asking for clarification, and it'll be directed to either myself or one of the other team on the project that we can give you further support in how to do the tests. And there's also resources for schools and stuff like that. So if anyone's listening and is involved in soil education and it's an area that maybe not as confident as they'd like to be in, there's a lot of resources there for schools to help them, I suppose, to help teachers and students increase their soil awareness.
Veronica, listen, that's fantastic. There's a huge amount of information there for anybody, and there's about another 10 questions we could go into. Sadly, we've kind of run out of time, so we'll have you back again just to kind of maybe delve a little bit further into some of those areas. So again, Veronica, thanks very much.
Thanks, Michael.
So finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and be back next week with more tillage news and advice.